So, Bruce White, an award-winning writer, earned an MA in history from McGill University in Montreal and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Minnesota. For more than 4 decades, Bruce has researched Indigenous history in Minnesota and North America. He has provided testimony on behalf of Native nations in cases testing treaties and the application of laws. His expert report in the 1994 Mille Lacs hunting and fishing case was quoted by Sandra Day O'Connor in her 1999 majority opinion upholding the rights of the Mille Lacs band to hunt and fish in the ceded area of the Treaty of 1837. Yeah. Excellent. Bruce's previous books include We Are at Home, Pictures of the Ojibwe People, and with Gwen Westerman, Minnesota Makoche, The Land of the Dakota, both published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And today, we celebrate Bruce's newest book, They Would Not Be Moved, also published by MNHS Press. And to quote the marketing copy, "They would not be moved, the enduring struggle of the Mille Lacs band of Ojibwe to keep their reservation," featuring a foreword by Melanie Benjamin, details how an Indigenous community repeatedly stood up for itself and won against overbearing pressures across decades. An 1855 treaty set aside thousands of acres to be the permanent home of the Mille Lacs band of Ojibwe, but for members to hold this land, resolute actions and unwavering commitment were required. White interprets decades of treaty negotiations to outline how each side understood the signed agreements. Ultimately, the story of the Mille Lacs Reservation is one of triumph, of courage and survival, and successful resistance. And I also will note Lee Egerstrom recently praised the book in The Circle, writing, "Protecting Minnesota Indigenous homelands isn't treading on new ground for the Minnesota Historical Society or for White. In this year alone, the Minnesota Historical Society Press has given readers Minnesota state and Indigenous history lessons showing what a people's persistence can produce at Mille Lacs." And Mary Ann Grossman in the Pioneer Press wrote, White writes clearly, giving readers enough information to understand legal arguments without getting bogged down in details. And she also noted that the book ends with a telling comparison of a time in 1862 when Mille Lacs band leaders were refused lodging in St. Paul to 2013 when the band purchased 2 hotels, the Intercontinental and the Doubletree by Hilton. In the foreword, Melanie Benjamin wrote, "It is impossible to overstate the importance of Bruce's testimony and written contributions to our legal battle. In federal Indian law, the U.S. Supreme Court has developed canons of construction or rules that the courts are required to follow whenever analyzing a treaty. One of these rules is that treaties must be interpreted as the Indians who have understood them at the time the treaty was signed. This painstaking effort is what Bruce White has undertaken for our people for over 3 decades. His research and testimony laid a critical foundation for all the litigation victories we would achieve in federal court over the years." And this afternoon, Bruce will read from and talk to us about They Would Not Be Moved, and we'll have time for questions afterwards, and of course, a book signing in the rotunda after that. So please help me welcome Bruce White.
Those were some of my best lines. Well, I don't have to explain the doctrine of treaty interpretation, so because of you mentioning Sandra Day O'Connor. Well, it's an honor to be here, and partly because I used to work for this institution many years ago, and when it was over by the Capitol. I used to work in that building, I don't know, maybe 10 years I worked there. And I got a good foundation in Minnesota history from working in the archives and delving into various documents. And I think that's one reason why I got hired in 1992 to work on the treaty case, because they said that I had I had useful background in Minnesota history. So that was really, I'd never worked on treaties before, and I've learned a lot since then. In any case, I know I have a lot of friends here, but I can barely make you out. It's so bright here and you're all in the dark. So a lot of you could have sat in the front row and I wouldn't have recognized you. People always sit in the back. Well, it's okay. You can see well enough up there. There are many ways to explain this book. I'll hold it up again. This is the gorgeous cover that the MNHS Press designers made. It's a wonderful cover, and the photograph in particular, and the colors. So I hope I won't tell you enough that you won't not be curious. Well, that's enough negatives. I hope you won't not be curious, and you'll want to go up and get the book, because you notice there are no pictures here of no maps. There are maps in the book, and some of the pictures of the Mille Lacs Band are in the other book that I did. We Are at Home. So there are a lot of pictures of the Mille Lacs Band in there that, some of the same people that are mentioned and discussed in the book, in this new book. Anyway, where to start in talking about the background of this story? I finally thought, I've got to talk about what is a reservation. What is a reservation? Because there's certain technical meanings, legal meanings, and so on, that are important to understand why they had to fight, why the Mille Lacs Band had to fight to keep that reservation. The first thing is, another line that you already heard, is that a reservation is a place set aside in treaty or other document for the use of Indian bands and Indian communities across the country. The term reservation is a term in the English language, so obviously it has background in England, the idea of a reservation, but it has a special meaning in relation to Indian reservations. So the idea is to set aside the land for the permanent and exclusive use of Indian tribes. At least that's the way it started. That's what it was supposed to be. Up until the 1850s, federal Indian agents and commissioners and so on, their goal was to remove Indians everywhere, to move them west. As American settlement moved west, the idea was we'll keep shifting Indian tribes farther and farther west, so that they will be out of the way of settlers and railroads and all of that. But at some point they realized this was counterproductive, because tribes never quite got to have a permanent homeland. And this caused all kinds of problems in relations between the U.S. government and Indian tribes. So in the 1850s, there was a commissioner of Indian Affairs, George Manypenny, and that really was his name. And he was a great man. He came up with the idea of, he was among the people who came up with the idea of having a permanent home. We'll give them a permanent home, and they'll never have to worry again about people coming in and taking their land or driving them farther and farther west. And so we'll create this place that they can call their own. And, you know, among the reasons was that if people didn't have a place that they can call their own, then they had no sense of ownership. And the economic point of view of Americans was that Indians had to become more selfish, really. They used to say, the trouble with the Indians is they share too much with each other, right? They actually said that. They need to have a sense of selfishness, that this is our own and we won't give it up. Well, yeah, they saw what the effect of that idea was later. But so they said, we'll give them a place. And it wasn't, and the reason they used the term reservation is partly because these places were reserved by the tribes themselves with the collaboration of the U.S. government out of land that they were ceding. You know, the idea of cession, of Indians signing treaties to give land to the U.S. government, which then could be divided up and sold to settlers and so on. Although, unfortunately, the practice of some settlers was to come in and take the land before the treaty actually occurred, which caused a lot of problems and another set of problems with the interaction between tribes and the U.S. And anyway, so in the Treaty of 1855 that was signed in Washington, D.C., with the Mississippi Ojibwe, and these included tribes along the Mississippi, and it included the Mille Band and other tribes throughout central Minnesota up to Lake Superior. Subsequently, there was a year before, there had been a treaty with the Lake Superior Ojibwe, and that covered you're all Minnesotans. I should say, I'm not really a Minnesotan, so I feel the need to explain this stuff that all of you know already, because I wasn't born in Minnesota. I lived overseas as a child. The only reason I knew anything about Minnesota was that my mother had been a historian working for the Minnesota Historical Society, and that explains how I got a job later. My first real job. In any case, so the Treaty of 1854 that was signed at La Pointe, Wisconsin, covered the South Shore, the area around Duluth, and the Arrowhead region of Minnesota, all the way up to Grand Portage. That was all covered in the Treaty of 1854. And then the Mississippi Chippewa, as they were called, signed the Treaty of 1855, which set aside a number of reservations. One of them was for the Mille Ojibwe, and it covered, well, see, as Minnesotans, you all know where Mille Lake is, north central Minnesota. The reservation that was created on the south end of Lake Mille was in land that had already been ceded by the tribes in the Treaty of 1837. But it was still owned by the U.S. government. It hadn't been sold. And so they said, well, we'll take some of the land and we'll turn it into this reservation. And the reason they picked that spot was that the Ojibwe Mille Band already was living on Lake Mille and in other areas in that region. And so they said, well, we'll create your reservation for that purpose. Now, in some of the legal cases, I've dealt with people on the other side, to say it politely, they say, well, it can't be a reservation because it was not reserved under a treaty. Well, it was reserved under a treaty. It just happened to be land that had already been ceded. So, you know, one of the ways that people deal with complicated issues is to oversimplify them and come up with, well, can I use the term cockamamie arguments about this and that. Another thing I think it's important to mention is that while the original idea of the reservation was that it be land that could be used exclusively by a tribe, the idea evolved somewhat in later years so that the exclusive ownership of land by the tribe was not necessary for the continuing existence of the reservation. So, and actual land ownership was not even necessary. And I'll mention a few facts about that later, but that's another thing we argue about in court cases. So as time went on, people said, well, I think one of the arguments they used to try to take away land from the Mille Ojibwe was to say, well, you know, the treaty says that it's for their use, but that doesn't mean it can't be shared with other people, which is, I don't know, it just seems, well, in my analysis, I use the technical term shell game to describe how they did that. You know, they'd come up with, oh, that's true, but on the other hand, we can also do this. And so the argument seems to shift around as time goes on. So they had this reservation. They lived more of their time, the Mille Lacs Band, lived more of their time on Lake Mille Lacs. There were still people who were members of the Mille Lacs Band who lived over on the St. Croix River and the Snake River and other areas in eastern Minnesota. And they began to spend more of their time at Mille Lacs. And so I should mention another thing, which is that the Mille Lacs Band has a reservation at Mille Lacs Lake, but the band also includes people who do not live at Mille Lacs Lake. There's a good contingent of Mille Lacs Ojibwe who live in Pine County. There's a community that used to be called the Lake Lena, and it's because of that group that Mille Lacs Band was able to build a casino at Hinckley. So that, you should know that there's a casino on the reservation at Mille Lacs, and there's a casino in the area of the other group of Mille Lacs Ojibwe. So technically speaking, the area in Pine County is not part of the Mille Lacs reservation at Mille Lacs. It's a separate section of what's called trust land. Trust land managed by the federal government and owned by a tribe, initially a tribe that only had shared ownership of land. And I'll explain. See, there's so many details that are interconnected legal doctrines and so on that you have to go through. So it's now people say, simplify it. Well, it's not simple. Somebody said, you know, you really ought to write a book about all the Indian treaties. I said, I've written 300 pages on one single treaty. If I were going to write a history of all the Indian treaties in Minnesota, it would be multi-volumed and go into thousands of pages. So I apologize for not having written that yet. maybe someday if they come up with funding. In any case, so they had this reservation and they were, inhabiting it, and things were going along pretty well. But then in 1862, the Dakota were involved in a battle with it's now called the U.S. Dakota War. And at the same time, there was a group of Ojibwe on the Mississippi, led by Hole in the Day, that appeared to be interested in engaging with the U.S. government for various reasons in cooperation with the Dakota. I don't think there was ever really a danger of that, but in any case, people were afraid of it. There were people that, there was widespread fear among white settlers in 1862. People on the south shore of Lake Superior even were afraid. And so it's sensible that, I guess, that they would be afraid that all the Indians are going to come and attack us. They would say, so we better be prepared. And as a result of, so the Mille Ojibwe resisted this. They had no interest in doing it. And, they met with officials at Fort Ripley and Crow Wing on the Mississippi and said, we're not going to fight against the U.S. government. And so, the U.S. government looked kindly on that. And then at that time, they decided, but the decision was made by the U.S. government, we'll have to figure out a way to move all the Indians. There was this idea they would go back to the idea of moving Indians to the west. The refrain of, make way for settlement started to be heard. And so they said, we're gonna move all the Indians on reservations, the Fond du Lac Reservation, Grand Portage, various reservations. We'll move them all to the west. The first idea was to move them to Leech Lake, which isn't that far away, but it was the beginning. And then by 1867, they were going to move them to the White Earth Reservation, which is in western Minnesota. So they were going to do this, and there was another treaty in Washington. Often Indian treaties seem to have been signed. Each one is designed to correct problems with the previous treaty. So let's move them all west. In some cases, they were thinking, we'll move them up to Red Lake, and we'll move them here, we'll move them there. And so this treaty was signed in Washington saying that all the people who had gotten reservations under the Treaty of 1855 would now sell their reservations back to the U.S. government. However, it included one detail, which was because of the behavior of the Mille Lacs Band in resisting the idea of going to war against the U.S. government, they would have the privilege of staying on their reservation at Mille Lacs, of not having to leave it. So this was important. This was an important privilege. And the person who negotiated it was a man named Henry Rice, sometimes known by the Ojibwe nickname White Rice. And I have to say, I once applied for a grant to write something about Henry Rice, and everyone called it the White on Rice Project. So in any way, Henry Rice was I'd say he's not trustworthy. He was not trustworthy. He had been a Minnesota senator, in the days when senators were elected by the legislature, And then he had been a trader and an Indian agent. And so he wrote a letter to Bishop Whipple. He was a good friend of Bishop Whipple, who was an early Episcopalian, quite well known in Minnesota. And he said to Whipple, well, the treaty is done. I wrote it myself without consulting anyone, either Indians or the government. That's just an indication of the kind of person he was. So he arrived at this, in talking to the Mille Ojibwe, he arrived at this idea is they'll sell their reservation, but they'll be able to stay there. Now, it seems like, what did he get out of that? Well, I have a theory that I describe in the book, which is that he had so much confidence in his own charm, in his own ability to negotiate, that he thought someday he would be able to persuade them to give up Mille Lacs and go to White Earth. And I think my theory holds up pretty well, because that seems to be the way it worked for many years, even though he knew that he had a solemn agreement with the Mille Lacs band that they could stay there. He never said anything about it to anybody. He never explained that that's what he understood, and that's what they understood. And this led to all kinds of trouble, which is that the people who, every time I say something, I have to backtrack and write a little footnote. All the footnotes are over here, and I have to write them. In the years that followed, people understood among the whites, they understood that the Mille Lacs, theoretically, the Mille Lacs band had the right to remain there, but they could be asked to leave if they were not behaving well toward white settlers. And they searched and searched for every example of some argument. Oh, the Indians came through here and their dogs barked at us, as an example of bad behavior. Or I wrote a whole article about how Indians visited settlements. It's like the, what's her name? The story of the pioneer family. I'm sure somebody said it. Anyway, I remember reading these stories as a kid. The wife has just baked a pie and put it on the windowsill to cool. The window is open. They came by and took our pie, people would say. And, there's a lot of nuances in this. There's an article that I wrote about this in Minnesota History Magazine in 1992 or so. So that's over here. That's another footnote. You can read all about it. In any case, so for years they were trying to come up with reasons why the Mille Lacs band should be forced to remove, but every time it was investigated, the government would send out Indian agents and they'd say, none of these stories really hold up. And there was even one Indian agent who said, we really don't think the settlers have to be protected from the Indians. In most cases, it's the opposite. The Indians have to be protected from the settlers. So that's in there. It's in the book. That's in the book. And anyway, so the years go by and people try to figure out ways, how can we get around this? How can we get them? And unfortunately, this involves the land office in Taylors Falls, Minnesota. And for years, my mother lived up the street from where that was. And it was near the William H.C. Folsom House. And William H.C. Folsom, I have to say, if I ever talk to anybody from Taylors Falls again, I'm going to have to say them. he colluded to steal the pine timber of the Mille Ojibwe. William H.C. Folsom, the great William H.C. Folsom, helped to cheat the Ojibwe out of their pine. And that was the big motivating factor, was not particularly settlers who wanted to come and settle on the Mille Reservation. It was logging men, loggers, or lumbermen, as they used to be called, including a man named Dwight Sabin, who manufactured freight cars using prison labor in Stillwater, and was a big purchaser of timber. And another one was the great Amherst Wilder, who, I have to say this, now you can say I'm being a little harsh on him, but his fortune was made from timber that was taken from Indian reservations. Now, the Amherst Wilder Foundation does some tremendous things, so let's factor that in. But Amherst Wilder did some things that he should not have been proud of. With the help of Thomas B. Walker, whose all the art he had in the Walker Art Center originally was purchased with money from timber taken from Indian reservations in Minnesota. T.B. Walker colluded with Amherst Wilder and Dwight Sabin to find ways to get land with the help of W.H.C. Folsom and his brother, who was the what's the term they use for the head of the land office? The term escapes me, but in any case, his brother was also in the land office. So this is fairly, I gotta say, this is fairly typical early Minnesota corruption. And Indian reservations were a prime subject for corruption. It's a sad story if you have any respect for, the great forefathers of Minnesota. But in any case, over the years, the lumbermen figured out ways to get title to land so that they could get the timber on the White Earth, not on the White Earth, but, well, they later did it on the White Earth Reservation, but at this time they did it on the Mille Reservation. So at the same time they were claiming, they said, well, the 1863 treaty means that the Mille Indian Reservation doesn't exist anymore. Because once the title began to be alienated from federal hands, they claimed that the reservation doesn't exist. But I think, as I mentioned before, reservations did not have to have even modicum of Indian title to land. A reservation can exist even if the land is, individual parcels of land are owned by non-Indians. A reservation can still exist. And that issue has been settled many, many times. The White Earth Reservation itself is sometimes described as a checkerboard. Some Indian ownership and some non-Indian ownership. So if you look at a map of the reservation and you see where the Indians own the land and where the white people own the land, it's a checkerboard of all the different land ownership. So this is an argument that we had in some of the court cases. And I remember accusing a witness on the other side of begging the question in the true sense of that term. That is, assuming the conclusion in the way you ask the question. So they would assume in their question, well, how can it be an Indian reservation because they don't own all the land? Which assumes that an Indian reservation can only be a place where the Indians own all the land, which is not true. So anyway, I think back along about those arguments. Court cases are really interesting. Something I first learned as a child when I watched Perry Mason with my grandmother every Sunday night. You know, in fact, I learned a lot about court cases, and I remember thinking that when I went in to testify, the lawyers would be frustrated with my answers, and they'd say, "Your Honor, would you please instruct the witness to answer either yes or no?" And I would always quibble, say, "Well, it depends on what you mean by that." I would say, and I'd go on, and they'd get so frustrated with me. But I was serving the purpose of history as well as I could. Anyway, so by the 1880s, a lot of the Mille Lacs Band's land had been taken by lumbermen. And in the first cases, the lumbermen masqueraded as settlers so they could say, in land contests, if they went to court, they could say, "Well, these poor settlers are being deprived of their land," without acknowledging that those poor settlers were working for lumber companies who would get the title to the land, cut the timber, and then never pay the taxes on the land. All they wanted was the timber. So in the years that followed, I remember looking up in the Mille Lacs County land records, some of which are upstairs in this building, or is it downstairs? I guess it's downstairs. But when I see them, they bring them up to me. Anyway, you would see that all this land that had been claimed by the lumber companies were no longer, they were tax forfeited. Because once the lumber companies got the land, they didn't need to own the land anymore. So they would just let it go. It's, part of the scheming process. So 1889, the great Minnesotan whose statue stands in front of the Capitol, Knut Nelson, who was a great man, was not really in cahoots with the lumber companies, and yet he did something that served their purposes, which is something called the Nelson Act, which was passed in January of 1889. And under the Nelson Act, Indians who lived on reservations all over the state would be encouraged to get allotments. They would allot, rather than having the land owned by the whole tribe, the Indians would get allotments. They would get 60 or 180, various sizes of allotments. And the idea was that once you allotted the existing population of a reservation, then there would be a lot of land left over, and that land could be sold to white people, settlers, real settlers, not lumber companies, although in some cases the land on these reservations got transferred under the table to lumber companies. And on the case of the Fond du Lac Reservation, it was not just lumber companies. There were match companies, you know, because matches require wood, and wood comes from timber, and timber comes from Indian reservations. So, in any case, so all of this, the Nelson Act was to separate out any agricultural land on a reservation, any timberlands, and I don't know, perhaps mineral lands and other things. And then any land that was not a timberland could be sold to, you know, at the cheapest rate of the land office, could be sold to settlers. Then, of course, there was some land that could be sold to lumber companies who were always there. Of course, in most reservations, they'd already gotten the timber through one means or another. So the corrupt part of this, well, I mean, you could look at this Nelson Act and think, you know, there's some unsavory parts of this, but the worst part was that Dwight Sabin, whose name I have mentioned, from Stillwater, figured out a way that he could get all his protected status for all the lands he'd been able to get previous to this. And he had been senator from Minnesota for a few years, and he got a provision put in the Nelson Act that would protect his land claims under the treaty. It wasn't really a treaty at all, it was an agreement. And he fitted in the last few weeks. And this was fairly well known at the time. I didn't realize it, but William Watts Falwell, who wrote one of the best histories of Minnesota, talks about him. You know, frequently when you read William Watts Falwell, you get a sense that he doesn't really like what he's writing about. He's kind of ashamed of what these people did. But, you know, he knew some of those people were still alive. I mean, when he lived through that period. He knew Alexander Ramsey. And by the way, I went to Alexander Ramsey High School. And sometimes now I call it War Criminal Ramsey High School, which I've never said that to my fellow alumni. But did I mention that my high school English teacher is here? Marilyn Christensen, who was my high school English teacher, was one of the best teachers I ever had, mainly because she always seemed to show that she had faith in you, that, you know, that you were doing well and you could do even better. And, oh, she was the greatest teacher. And thank you, Marilyn, for coming. Well, that's yeah. Well, see, I wasn't going to make you stand up, but I appreciate that you did. But I remember that she was my teacher the year my father died. And it was a tough time, and she didn't live that far away from us. But one day she showed up at our place and with a big box of cookies. And that was so wonderful. So, you know, I think that good teachers deserve to be appreciated. I really was encouraged to write. She even encouraged me to do an independent study. And while I was not that prompt in turning in the results of my research, she gave me all the encouragement I needed to actually finish it. I think the problem was I was not a very good typist. And I don't know. Well, I finished it. I did finish it finally. I think it could have been better. Well, anyway, war criminal Ramsey High School. There were a couple of good teachers. I think that the teachers one remembers are always the best teachers, the ones that you really felt as though you were on the same wavelength. And that was so important. So there were a couple other teachers like that at Ramsey that I still remember. And another one that I now communicate with on Facebook. So, it's amazing what you can get on Facebook. Anyway, so, okay, see, now, it's such a complicated story, but I'll just tell you that Henry Rice came to Mille in 1889 to get them to sign the agreement that was the Nelson Act. And when he did, he said he wanted them to know, your chiefs were always right. You did have the right to remain here. And you hear that and you think, it would have been nice if he had said that in 1872, in 1882, in 1883, in 1884. But he was always quiet because he still thought, I'll persuade them to move. Anyway, he said, well, you'll get allotments. You can get allotments at White Earth, you should really go to White Earth because the agricultural land is better, and we think you should all be farming. But you can also get allotments at White Earth. Not at Mille Lacs. And the truth is that he was lying. He never was able to let them get allotments. All through the 1890s, they kept saying, Henry Rice told us we could get allotments. Well, there's problems with that. And Rice finally died in the 1890s, and they still said, Henry Rice told us we could get allotments. Federal officials figured out one bogus reason after another. So there's a lot that happened, but they did get allotments in 1925. Allotments. And how much allotment land did they get? Less than 2,000 acres. The reservation had been 61,000 acres. And of that, at least half of it was timberland that was stolen from them. So a couple thousand acres. But that's still, some of that land is where the Mille Lacs Casino is now. And some of the land is along the south shore. There was a piece of some land on the east side of the lake at Isle. So this tiny pieces of land gave them a base in which they could rebuild. And so, there was a mention of owning the hotels in St. Paul, which, the reason that's such a, what's the word, trenchant or a striking piece of information that they own these hotels is because they were in St. Paul in 1862, and they were attacked by German immigrants because they were suspected of being Dakota. And the German immigrants threw rocks at them. And the hotel keeper said, "No, we have no place for you." Right before Christmas, "We have no place for you." And the Indian agent had to let them camp out in his backyard, which was right over here by the cathedral. His backyard. He had a house near where the cathedral is now. So the fact that they could, in the 2000 whatever, buy 2 hotels, take that, Minnesota. It's a wonderful turnabout. And, you may think I'm too harsh. Perhaps I am, but it's nice to see. It's nice to see good things happen to people who really suffered. Because in this whole period, people are trying to get them to leave. There were cases where the sheriff, the Mille Lacs County Sheriff, burned down their villages to try to get them to leave. And there's one story after another. It's all in here. As well as I could tell the story, I've tried to tell that story. And I hope that, one way or another, you could probably get it in the library too. My friend Jim Seelar is thinking, why is he saying that? Say that the only way to get it is in the bookstore upstairs. Tell him that. Well, questions.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. I could listen to you for hours. But yeah, let's go ahead. We'll take some questions.
Ani Boujou, I'm Shelley Diaz. I am a Mille Lacs Band member, and I know all these stories very well. And just to let you know that it continues today. Mille Lacs County has still got lawsuits against Mille Lacs Band. They say it doesn't exist. And so we've been fighting our whole life, my whole life, and hearing the stories from my grandmother. So we don't want pity, we just want our rights, So thank you very much, Bruce. It was nice to hear.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for coming. And I've gotten to know a number of band members over the years, and it's been a great pleasure to be able to work with a community that cares so much about their history and knows so much about their history. And I've learned so much.
Yeah. Other questions? Great, yeah, over here.
I'm just curious about I have pretty vivid memories of, was it the 80s and 90s when the fishing rights were really challenged on the lake? And I'm curious about what was the legal standing that the people who brought the lawsuits against the band at that point in time, or tried to prevent the Mille Lacs band from exercising their rights to fish? What was the legal standing that they tried, what was the legal basis that they thought they could stand on for that? And did the courts, in Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion, did the courts then set new or clarify standards that would make it harder in the future to challenge those rights?
Well, Sandra Day O'Connor said you have to interpret treaties in the light of the understanding of the Native people who signed them. And over the years, band members would say, you know, we signed a treaty and we have rights under that treaty. And the people who worked for the conservation agencies would say, well, the truth is, those are really old treaties. And you don't have much standing anymore. You know, and I wrote an article about this called The Myth of the Forgotten Treaty. Because the truth is, they were not forgotten treaties. There were people in Minnesota governmental agencies who would like to forget the treaties, but they couldn't ever forget them because, well, eventually, when, you know, in the early days when tribes would talk about their treaty rights, they really had no way to get to court. No, they couldn't afford to hire lawyers to take the cases to court. You know, I went through the records of the in Minnesota it used to be called the Game and Fish Commission, and now it's called the DNR, and in between it was called the Conservation Department. And there was all this evidence that treaties were discussed. They talked about the treaties. And some people realized that the treaties had some meaning, and other people would say, well, you know, they're so long, they're so old. Treaties are so old. So, you know, basically, I think that the ultimate legal argument these folks had was, the treaties are so old, you know, which is, I think, is not a great legal argument. And, you know, they argued that the treaty, well, they had a right under the Treaty of 1837. That was the main treaty that had a provision for hunting and fishing. They would say, well, the Treaty of 1855 didn't have that provision, and neither did the Treaty of 1863. And yet, at the same time, there was nothing in the treaties that said we're revoking the rights under the Treaty of 1837. So that was not a great argument. And, you know, I think it was the greatest argument for the state of Minnesota was that they wished it to be so. And, you know, I don't know, that currently the state government does not contest those rights anymore. And before there was a recent decision affirming the existence of the Mille Reservation. The state of Minnesota had already accepted the existence. I mean, while state officials going back to the 1920s were always saying, well, it's not really a reservation anymore. This is another version of that other argument, which is, it's a former reservation. It's an old reservation. You know, as though something being old means it doesn't exist anymore. Sort of like the Declaration of Independence. It's so old. Or the Constitution of the United States. It's so old. You know, nobody thinks that, I hope. Okay, I hope. Let's not bring that up.
All right, we've got a question on the other side. Just give me a moment while I get my steps in. All right.
Thank you, Miigwech Bruce, for writing your book. My name is Thomas King from Red Leg Nation, Leech Lake, and White Earth. I found some research over at Anoka County Historical Society, and the historians there pulled it out of their system for me. In this story, it says there was 91 women and children massacred in 1839 by the Dakota. Were they from Mille?
Well, I talk about that 1839 in the book. It's a very sad story. And the people who were killed were from Mille, most of them. The thing is that there were other bands from like Leech Lake and other places that went to, well, see, it all took place when these various bands were returning from Fort Snelling. They had a meeting with the Indian agent, or the Indian agency.
And they were going to give them annuities, and they didn't give them to them.
The annuities were, yeah, the Treaty of 1837 annuities were not, at that point, paid at Fort Snelling. They were paid in other places. And so, well, it's a complicated story, but the truth is that the Mille men were the ones who were most, well, what's the word? The ones who received much of the damage from the Dakota. Even though, if you look at the history, I've pointed out that the Ojibwe at Mille were, many of them related to the Dakota through intermarriage. And there's one of the chief clans at Mille is the Maingan, or Wolf clan. And the Maingan and Wolf clan are people who descend from intermarriage with Dakota. Because normally a clan membership is descended through the father. And the Dakota who married Ojibwe people from Mille were mostly men marrying Ojibwe women. So essentially the clan, Wolf clan, was created to give, so that they could have a clan. Anyway, so the answer is, see, look at this. This is an example of how I testify in court. I go on, and so the answer to your question is yes. I'm sorry.
I have one more comment. I interviewed my Aunt Annie Kane. She was 96 years old at the time, and she's passed now. And she said they called Henry Rice Wild Rice. Wild and crazy Rice.
I think that was sensible.
And I have this on film.
Well, I've been known to call him an SOB, or worse. I think that's why I never quite finished my study of Henry Rice. I'll have to go back to it. It would be a story that the Rice descendants would not be happy with.
We have time for another couple of questions. I see, a couple more hands here. I'll go here and then in the back. All right. I'll just sneak by here and I'll hand this down. Oh, here, if you just want to hand it down the aisle.
Just a couple of questions. In your work, did you begin to learn how to use the language Anishinaabe? Have you
How to read the language?
read or speak the language and hear and interpret the language, or did you use interpreters? Did you work with elders? And the treaties themselves, were they always written in English, or was there interpretation and writing in Anishinaabe?
Unfortunately, there are very few treaties written in the languages that were translated into the language of the native signers. And in the book that I worked with on the Dakota, we found a Dakota version of a treaty, but I never found an Ojibwe version of a treaty. I did work with elders. There was not a lot of material that was written in Ojibwe. So I couldn't use it, even if I were expert in the language. I did when I was in grad school. I took an Ojibwe language class at the U with Angie Northbird, who was a wonderful woman from Red Lake. And it turns out one of my fellow students, who I met again recently, was the daughter of an elder from Mille that I was working with named Jim Clark. And he was wonderful, wonderful man. And I think what I learned from talking with elders is getting a sense of just the view of the world and how Ojibwe people lived throughout the late 19th century into the 20th century. There are people like Anton Troyer who have done interviews in which he's actually found stories that people told about for example, about what happened in 1862. And he's published those in Ojibwe and in English. And so those are pretty interesting. Very infrequently can you find documents in Ojibwe in government records. Occasionally I've worked on research in other areas, Ojibwe communities in Michigan, for example, where you'll be looking through the documents and suddenly there's a letter in Ojibwe written to an Indian agent, and those are just wonderful things to find. So, there could be things. I would say one document that I found after I testified in the 1837 treaty case, but in Kansas City, there's a letter from somebody at a white guy living at Mille Lacs who said he had met the chief Wadena, and Wadena had told him basically the whole tradition, the traditional knowledge of the meaning of the Treaty of 1837. It's all in English, but it's an incredible letter. I mean, it corresponds to some of the, you can find various legal, not legal documents, but you can find in historical records, you can find accounts of what the Treaty of 1837 meant to the Ojibwe. And this letter, which is written in like 1928, tells the tradition in the exact same, almost the exact same words that they told it earlier. So it blew my mind when I saw that. And, they don't want me to keep talking, I know, but I would say that what really is even more wonderful is that my grandfather was a minister at Onamia around 1910. And while he was there, he got to meet Wadena, this man whose letter I was reading, and also McGeezy, who was the son of the chief Shabashkung, who was one of the signers of the Treaty of 1855. And so, when I was 13 years old, my mother did an oral history interview with my grandfather about his years as a Methodist minister. And in that interview, he talked about Chief Wadena. So I heard this when I was 13 years old, and it didn't make much sense to me until, 30 years later, I first started working on the history of the Mille Lacs band, and then I went back. I thought, I don't think my grandfather talked about him. I go back, and there it is. He did talk about him. he talked about his struggle to keep the band from having to go to White Earth. So I guess that indicates that I might have been influenced without realizing it. Anyway.
And we have one more question here in the back.
Yes, talking about personalities and going back to your footnotes, do you have any quick opinions on Henry Schoolcraft or Tolliver or Joseph Nicolay?
Joseph who?
Nicolay?
Oh, Joseph Nicolay. Well, when I was first working at the Historical Society, I was roped into helping to publish Joseph Nicolay's journals, and I got to say, they are wonderful. They're just wonderful. Later on, I used the journals of Lawrence Tolliver because he says so much about tribal leaders who came to Fort Snelling. So, and I got a few quotations from him in here. Who was Schoolcraft. Yeah, no, I have a few problems with Henry Schoolcraft. I gotta say, I put him in the category of problematic people. That he was interested, he had his own interests. But, you know, his work some of it is pretty good, so I've used it. But you have to, you know, when you do historical research, you have to consider the source. And, you know, when somebody writes something, you have to think, well, okay, can we trust him? You know, sometimes you can't trust Lawrence Tolliver, but most of the time, I believe what he says. And the same with, Joseph Nicolay above all others, I trust him. And he had a kind of incredible sympathy, seeming better understanding of Native people than a lot of others. Schoolcraft is borderline. But, you know, I guess I have an ambiguous opinion about him.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. Another round of applause for Bruce White. Excellent.
Thank you all.